Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Sim Racing Rejects podcast, the only podcast in which it's scientifically provable that at least 50% of the staff isn't wearing pants right now. Today we're going to be talking about what makes a good downloadable content pack for a sim racing game.
Sim racing and just racing games as a whole are a hobby that's fueled by DLC much more than the average video game genre. Obviously, if you buy something like Call of Duty over the years, something like Halo, you can get away with just playing the base game. You don't have to download any map packs, any story expansions, or anything like that. Although, obviously, with the introduction of live service games, this is a lot more frequent in other genres. But for the majority of their existence, DLC has really been just this optional path you can go down if you really like a game and want to spend more money on it. In racing games, DLC has been a lot more frequent. Even dating back to the days of the mid-2000s before paid DLC had picked up steam in the console gaming world, games like Race 07 and GTR2 even, GT Legends, stuff like the original R Factor, had a lot of payware content available for it, as well as additional DLC packs that really served to stretch the lifespan of either, again, a racing sim or your typical arcade racing game. But a lot of companies have found out over the years it's actually really tough to get a DLC plan down pat and push out content that people actually really like playing, or that is worthwhile for the customers to buy, or just gives people a lot of bang for their buck. It's a very tough line to walk, especially because racing as a whole has so many different subcategories of fans who either like or dislike specific racing series. Each game, regardless of what content it features, there are cars that should be added, there are cars that shouldn't be added, there are tracks that should be added, there are tracks that are best left on the cutting room floor, and even when it comes to implementing new game modes, new features, new ways to play what is a beloved racing game or a racing sim, it's really tough for teams to get it right. And over the years, we've seen an equal amount of teams and developers in the industry do a really great job of releasing DLC packs that literally everyone who owns the game ended up buying day one. And we've also seen some major developers release DLC packs where the community went, what the fuck, why are you giving this to us? So we figured this would be the best topic for episode number 5, is to really break down our favorite DLC packs, why they worked so well, what makes a good DLC pack, because there's a lot of ways that devs can go astray in that situation. What's considered a fair price for DLC, because it often does fluctuate based on the sim you're playing or the game you're playing, and what people are willing to pay for pieces of content, and their what they deem acceptable prices fluctuates year after year as other games set certain trends. And then lastly, we really want to touch on the topic of payware mods, because payware mods have, by extension, become unofficial third-party DLC that people are having to pay for, and how to handle that can of worms, because that introduces a whole other element of just, again, buying more DLC for a racing game and wondering if it's worth the money or not, and if it really does contribute to the game. So we figured this would be a neat place to talk about kind of the design elements that go into making good racing game DLC. It's a bit avant-garde of a topic, but whatever, we do things our own way here on the show. Well, I'm looking at my list here, and I think it's important to kind of document the absolute best DLC packs that have been released for racing games over the years, to kind of have a baseline template of what has unanimously worked, and anytime a company has released that particular pack, basically the entire user base of a game bought it because it was just so worth the money. Number one with a bullet, even though I'm not a Gran Turismo fan, in fact, I'm a guy who bought a PS4 for GT, played it for about a month, and then shelved it, is the Lewis Hamilton DLC for Gran Turismo Sport. So what this was, for those who aren't quite aware or don't follow the console gaming side of things, basically Gran Turismo Sport hasn't had a lot of DLC. It's more of a live service game. There's just new stuff added to the game for free with each passing month or a couple of months based on their post-release plan. But one of the things you could pay for as additional DLC was essentially a set of time trial challenges across every track in the game using a Mercedes car, and you would be racing Lewis Hamilton's Ghost. It was basically a DLC time trial mode. But here's why it was really cool. If you beat Lewis Hamilton's Ghost, you got the satisfaction that you really beat Lewis Hamilton. This is one of the best drivers in the world, period, right now, and you got to race against his physical Ghost. No other game's done that. Second, as you played through the challenges, I think there was like 15 to 20 different tracks that you could beat his ghosts on. You unlocked a ton of like worthwhile shit in the game. If you beat, let's say, all of his lap times at the 15 or 20 tracks, the game would give you 60 million credits, which increased the credit cap in Gran Turismo, which I think was originally at 20 million, to like 3 times that amount. So with Gran Turismo being basically a car collecting RPG, being good at the game and completing this optional DLC opened up a lot of doors that a lot of people originally didn't have with this game. Gran Turismo Sport's a bit of a grind. This mode said, hey, for our hardcore players, if you're really good at Gran Turismo, we're going to help you get ahead in the game. We're going to give you challenges that are really, really intense and curated for that top 1% of our player base, and we're going to respect our players by giving them something really cool to fuck around with. And just the whole ideology behind that Lewis Hamilton pack is just really, really intelligent. The fact that they respected their players, the fact that they put out a piece of DLC that wasn't just a set of cars or a set of tracks, but really added something unique to the game and gave you an incentive to play it because the reward for completing it was just so extreme. I think they nailed that. Second piece of DLC I want to touch on goes back a long ways to the days of NFS Pro Street, a Need for Speed game that is criminally underrated and very much an offshoot of what Need for Speed is typically known for. The Energizer Lithium Extender Pack. Basically, Need for Speed Pro Street had one DLC pack released for it in its lifetime, but the DLC pack that came out for it was priced very reasonably at like $8 or $10. It had 16 cars, all of which you could modify and put body kits on and parts upgrades and the stuff you could do in NFS Pro Street. There's nothing like, oh, you can't touch this car like you'd see in future games with the Ferrari license where you couldn't paint or give engine upgrades to cars. So it was 16 cars added to the game. You couldn't see every car in the span of an evening because you probably didn't have enough money to buy them in career mode, point blank, and there were just so many of them that there was a lot to see. And it also included, I think, 2 or 3 additional track environments. So you got a pretty serious amount of bang for your buck for not a lot of money. Further expanding on that topic, a company who kind of followed the blueprint set by Need for Speed Pro Street's Energizer Lithium Extender Pack, Assetto Corsa Cuno Simulazione, their very first pack ever for Assetto Corsa, Dream Pack 1 with the Nürburgring Nordschleife, and like 10 really highly sought after cars, McLaren P1, the McLaren F1, the Corvette C7R, the Sauber C9. Just for $10 you got basically the best version of the Nürburgring ever made in a racing sim, and cars people actually wanted to drive. And with AC being a game that isn't pick up and play, it takes a day or two to learn the nuances of each car. There was just a crazy amount of replay value, and every piece of content that came with that one particular pack was like a bona fide great addition to the game. Most of those cars are used, as standard in league. You pretty much have to own that pack to race in most leagues in AC in 2021 or 2022, I should say now.
And not only that, but as time's gone on and they've reduced the price, I have personally gotten hundreds and hundreds of hours out of that one specific DLC in tons of different leagues, and the price has been reduced to $2 or $3 when it's on sale. You can get 100% of all the different Dream Packs and DLC content for AC, often on $5 to $15. You can get Assetto Corsa with all the DLC on sale for Christmas and stuff like that. So once the pack was released, at initial release, the price was reasonable for the, price to time ratio you were getting out of it. But as time has gone on, people have continued to get more and more and more time out of it, and the price has gone down and gone down and gone down and gone down, almost to the point it's obligatory to have it.
Well, and that ideology of AC bundling the entire DLC collection into one very small purchase with the price reduced and reduced and reduced to the point where you should probably own it by now. I don't think anyone watching this, or who's going to watch this, doesn't own all of AC's DLC because it's just been priced so reasonably. And that ideology comes from Forza Motorsport 2. I don't know if a lot of people are aware about that, but Forza Motorsport over the years, beginning with Forza Motorsport 2, after the game was on the market for about a year to 2 years, what Turn 10 did was they released the Platinum Hits version of Forza Motorsport 2. And what this was, it was a 2-disc set for the Xbox 360. The first disc was the game, which, it really hadn't changed, right? You'd still just put it in the console and it would update. But the second disc was all the DLC that had ever been released for the game, including really weird, exclusive stuff like pre-order cars that were only available at certain retailers. I believe there were some unicorn cars. I believe there was some like time limited DLC that crept back up again that they put on this bonus disc. So the fact that you could buy basically the entire collection of Forza Motorsport 2 along with its entire post-release DLC plan for $20 kind of set a trend that a lot of other devs, including Kunos, would follow in the coming years when it came to racing sims, because it was just such a good format that worked. You could buy Forza at launch, and again, they followed this with pretty much every other game that would come out from that point on. You could either buy Forza at launch for the full $60 or $70, whatever it ended up being, and then buy each piece of DLC that came out as it was released. But if you didn't get on board the Forza train right at launch, all you had to do was wait a year, and they would release like basically a greatest hits edition with like a spare disc featuring all their DLC. And I'm glad they did, because again, it's set a trend in the sim racing scene now, where teams like AC do that, where you'll see like the Project Cars franchise doing that, where after the game's on the market for a year and a half, you get basically a cheaper collection with everything that's ever been released for the game. And I know that other industries do it, but Forza was probably the first, or I shouldn't say other industries do, but other genres do it. But Forza was really the first in the racing game realm to do it, and do it effectively, and to the point where other people started copying it. And only after a few years did you see more and more genres start to adapt that same format. So basically what we're saying here is that how to do this DLC stuff right, and generally what makes it really either cost effective or just enjoyable for people to pick up and incentivize for people to pick up, is just a lot of stuff for not a lot of money, and then give people an option to buy it as a complete set at a later date. But that'll kind of roll into our next topic of what does make a good DLC pack, because there's a lot of ways to go about it rather than just releasing cars and releasing tracks.
It's a very, very good question. So when we want to think about what a good downloadable content pack is, that's kind of a difficult question, because obviously everybody has a different idea of what is worth their money, which is an expression of their time, right? When I think about a good DLC pack, I have a number of qualifiers, and it depends on if it's a DLC pack with multiple pieces of content, if it's a single payware mod, if it's something that's included with a game or not. When I personally try to define what a good DLC pack is, I take a look at a number of factors, namely, 1, is the DLC pack representing something that isn't in any other simulator or is hard to find at high quality in another simulator and does it better than everywhere else? We're talking about here things like the fact that VRC just recently released a Trans Am TA2 car for Assetto Corsa, one of the first racing simulators to get a modern Trans Am car since the series' re-emergence in the early 2000s and repopularization in the early 2010s. I think about whether or not I'm going to use it for a long amount of time. For example, I bought the Racing Studio Lotus 79 for Assetto Corsa, and then put about 5,000 to 10,000 kilometers on the car, which is more than any other car I've ever put in any car in any racing simulator ever. And it cost me, I think, like $1.50, I think maybe $2 or something like that. I consider that an extremely good purchase for the ratio of time I then get out of that product. I might also consider something like Automobilista 2. They have 1970s Formula 1 tracks that aren't available in any other simulator other than ripped mods from old GPL and R-Factor that might have been taken forward into Assetto Corsa. Being able to get an actual high-quality version of that that's vetted and created by an in-house simulation studio rather than a crappy ripped mod source, in my opinion, is worth paying $5 or $10 for that DLC if I'm going to use that track for 1,000 Ks, 2,000 Ks, 3,000 Ks, and put a couple thousand miles on it, right? I definitely think that that's worth it. The ratio of cost to time and usability is going to be different for everybody else, but at the core foundation of what people consider a good downloadable content pack is, will I use it? How much will I use it for? Will I get my money out of it? And is the experience either unique or high enough quality to justify that purchase price? For example, I know me and Austin have mentioned this before, but the Nürburgring Nordschleife is in like 5, 6, 7 different racing simulators, and it's always released as a paid DLC. I'm kind of sick of paying for it, but I know I'm going to put a couple thousand kilometers on it in every simulator I ever use. So I buy it. And if I can't buy it, if that sim is moddable, I check if there's a vintage version of it, which is free. And there normally is. For example, for AC, for R Factor 2, for R Factor 1, there is a free vintage version of the Nürburgring available. There's a 1967 version that's been ported through a couple times. And I kind of weigh, is that worth getting versus paying for the laser scan DLC one? That's a personal decision that has to be made by everybody. But at the core of it, there is that kind of raw calculation. Do I get my money's worth out of the amount of time or uniqueness I'm going to get from this experience?
Yeah, I think the overall question to ask is, when it comes to like single pieces of content, not talking about strictly DLC packs, but just what cars and what tracks are selected to be put in a DLC pack, we generally prefer if it's something that's going to get used. There are a lot of tracks, and Race Room I think is notorious for this. There are a lot of tracks in Race Room that I will never drive. I will never drive it. I believe Nagara was one of the tracks. I will never drive it. I think they have Chang International Circuit or like a couple of different Chinese tracks that, like, honestly, I'd never heard of. So, like, I unfortunately am, 100% content owner in both Race Room and for a period of time also iRacing as well. So, like, I bought them just to have everything. But I would say 60 to 70% of Race Room's track roster I have never raced at. Maybe I've driven on it, once or twice to do shakedown laps and just a offline practice session. But when I go online, I'm always racing at Zandvoort, Hockenheim, or the Nürburgring. So there's a lot of money that has been unfortunately pissed away on just really obscure content that no one really asked for. And I think going forward, developers really have to factor that into their DLC releases, because sure, you might be able to scoop up all these various licenses and stuff like that, but at the same time, you don't waste development resources and oversaturate your own game's marketplace on just crap that nobody's going to play. When you only have a finite amount of dev time and a finite amount of staff to work on certain tracks or certain cars or whatever you're cramming into your game, make sure it's something people are going to play. Because most games aren't a live service to the extent that you'll see something like Halo or Call of Duty be. Most racing sims that we get released, they only have time and resources to build 7 additional tracks from the time the game is released until the next project is started. So make sure it's stuff people are actually going to want to drive. And I think Assetto Corsa Competizione did a good job in that. A lot of the stuff that has been released for that game as post-release DLC is like stuff people really wanted. Laguna Seca, I believe, was DLC. Mount Panorama, Bathurst was DLC. GT4 was DLC. They didn't, waste time building, a slow genetic cup car that was already in 5 other racing sims and would not get used. They made sure that, okay, we have a very finite post-release DLC plan. We're probably only going to release 4 or 5 paid pieces of content for this game. Let's make sure it's stuff that people are going to race out and buy and get a lot of use out of. The other thing that I think makes a good DLC pack is that you can't see everything in an evening. And this is something that a lot of people think about. A lot of people tend to get caught up in exactly what cars and tracks are featured in a DLC bundle or what modes are featured in a DLC bundle. And like, that's fine, and I enjoy kind of, breaking down the intricate details of, what piece of content should they or shouldn't they have added, or what gaps in the car track list they should have added. But I think what a lot of my criticism of DLC pieces boils down to is how quickly I get through it. I noticed, because I did buy the not the complete edition, but whatever the whole legendary or ultimate edition of Dirt 5 was, I found I was frustrated not at the array of cars and tracks that were made as DLC for that game or the post-release DLC plan, but I found I got through the DLC way quicker than I should have. I found I would sit down and play like a new DLC release, like a new career tier or a new pack that got released for Dirt 5, and I finished it in a couple of hours. And even though I definitely appreciated, the 2 or 3 cars that got added and some of the playground props that were added for it, just being able to whip through it that fast was really disappointing. And that's happened really in a number of different sims over the years, and I'm seeing that with I think AMS2 with Racing USA Part 2. The way they've released this DLC pack where you only had Cleveland and the 1998 kart car, Well, I saw everything basically in less than an evening, in less than an hour. So while I'd already paid for the season pass and couldn't really gauge it on an individual purchase basis, if I would have bought Racing USA Part 2 as a standalone DLC pack, I would have been really bummed out that I saw everything in like 30 minutes.
Yeah, if I pay money for an experience of additional content to a game that I expect to be playing a lot, and I can get through and get familiar with and learn all of that content 30 minutes to 1 hour a piece and be done with it in a day, it's probably not enough content to be released in a pack, right? And as I mentioned earlier, that RSS Lotus 79, the reason why that mod has so many hours for me is because it's a ground effects car that's almost impossible to set up and drive, right? So it takes so many hours to really, really get proficient in, which is a very, very rare quality for most vehicles.
Do you remember for any like either arcade racer games or just like mainstream stuff where you bought a DLC pack because you're like, hey, it seemed cheap or it seemed like it would be worthwhile grabbing, and you just raced through it and had nothing to do by the end of the night?
Yeah, there was a 100% sale deal on Race Room Racing Experience, I think back in 2020 or 2021. That basically I got all the content for Race Room at the time for $5, and 90% of it I never touched, and everything I did touch was only the stuff that was unique. And I know you mentioned for yourself that you really find a lot of value in something being applicable to a lot of different drivers and being raceable for a lot of people. But for me, I'm kind of the opposite. I want stuff that's unique when I buy a DLC. You know what I mean? I want...
That's a good point.
Trans Am, which isn't in any sim. I want like old IMSA GT prototypes, which are extremely rare to get a good quality mod of. I want the Coors light racing truck series that I know we've mentioned here a couple times, as CCA had a pro racing series for light trucks with like 4-speed manual gearboxes.
Yeah.
I want a late 60s to early 70s F1 with a tiny bit of wing, because most people don't do that, right? Because they either skip to the Lotus 72 or they do like the 1968 F1 series if they do vintage F1. I want, whenever possible, I've got the opposite opinion. I want the most unique experience possible. So often I buy a DLC and I go, this is just a fucking pack of cars I've already driven and something else. And there's functional equivalency here. I've already bought this for R-Factor. I already bought this for R-Factor 2. I already bought this in iRacing. Why am I now buying this in Automobilista or Assetto Corsa or Race Room, right?
Yeah, I brought that up on a quick little YouTube video I put out a couple weeks back, where I noticed, I mean, even though I loved the Nürburgring to death and have done, how many thousands of kilometers there, it got kind of ridiculous that I discovered I'd bought in the track 7 times over, and 5 of those used the exact same point cloud data, so I really did buy the exact same track 5 times.
Yeah, if something's considered genre obligatory, release it when the game comes out, and don't charge me extra money for it if you feel like you have to have it in the game. At release, put it in the game.
Yeah, and you know what? I noticed that was happening a lot with R-Factor 2, because R-Factor 2 is one of those games I just kind of, held off to the side, didn't have it installed. But when I got back into it, I'm like, you know what? Like, I'll try out some of the newer content, and I'll give it an honest shot when I played it. So I'd say about 6 months to a year ago, I booted it up. I got, a bunch of content off the store or R-Factor 2's own storefront, which is the newer content released by Studio 397. And I found that, like, I was just buying GT cars. And I'm like, well, I already have these fucking cars in, like, every other game. I already have, like, these tracks, like Sebring International Raceway. I'm like, man, like, I just spent, $15 on a version of Sebring that I already had in Assetto Corsa for free because someone had ripped it from Forza 7. And why did I buy this? So, like, if you are, as a developer, if you are going to overlap the available content that you find in other sims, release it as on-disc content so you don't have people buying the same stuff over and over again. And I think that's really important to touch on. I'm glad you actually brought that up. Because, I mean, like, just buying the Nürburgring that many times is frustrating enough. When it starts extending to individual cars, to individual tracks that aren't even, like, A-listers, Like, how many times am I going to end up buying Road America? How many times am I going to end up buying Laguna Seca? That gets kind of ridiculous.
Well, and the thing that frustrates me about this is, and again, it's easy to complain, and this is meant to be one of our more positive episodes, so I'm sorry if it comes off this way, but when I look at what I want to do with the simulator, I have two options. I kind of think these are the main two options. I'm either using simulator as a fun thing to drive a car in a realistic way that I would never be able to drive in real life. And for most people, that's kind of why they use the simulator. I feel like that's fair, right? Like, I would never be able to afford this, I would never be able to do this, and therefore I do it on the sim. Would you say that's fair?
Yep.
And then two, I'm using it as a training tool for something I'm actually going to go and race in real life, which is one of the reasons why a lot of my students get coaching from me. Correct?
Yep.
If I'm in either one of those positions, why would I want to race the same car and track all the time when I could be broadening my skills out by doing something different? How many sims have Gingerman Raceway, Grattan Raceway, the new Ridge Motorsports Park? How many of them have Raceway Park? Have Ozarks International Raceway that just got built in Missouri in the U.S.? How many of them have all, and I don't mean some, I mean all of like the small club tracks from the UK where racing is super popular? How many places have an official version of like Circuit de Lebanon from France, which is a semi-pro level circuit, right? I feel like a lot of these simulation companies focus on everybody's going to buy a GT3 car at Zandvoort, at the Nürburgring, at Silverstone, but they don't have, you mentioned the Ginetta Cup, they don't have the Ford Ka Cup. A lot of them don't have the Renault Clio Cup. People don't have a spec Miata. People don't have a spec Porsche 944. Nobody's done a simulator based off of Lemons or Chump Car or like an amateur endurance series like that. You know what I mean?
And here's something really interesting that kind of touches on your point and expands on it a bit. These games are primarily marketed as training tools. Like, if you play this game, you will become a better race car driver. Well, okay, right. But how many people actually get the opportunity to race at Laguna Seca? Not a lot.
Not very many. Unless you live in California and it's a local amateur track for you, the chances are that you're going to be racing there as a touring pro are extremely low. And if you do race there as a local amateur, you're probably going to the other tracks in California like Buttonwillow or Willow Springs or some of the other stuff nearby instead, because the entry fees are cheaper because it's a lower level track.
So you probably have a higher chance of racing at these lower level tracks instead of Monaco or Suzuka or anything like that. So then why are we ignoring them? Like, you got to think, iRacing, in its infancy was started basically as a training tool for amateur and semi-professional drivers, but it spiraled into, well, let's just get the whole Cup Series schedule. Let's just get the whole IndyCar schedule. Yeah,
which is really annoying, because if you go back and you look at the very early days of iRacing, what tracks did they get? They got FIA Grade 2 or Grade 3 or non-FIA graded tracks like Summit Point, like Lime Rock Park, like Mid-Ohio, things like that, right? But ever since they've exploded and gotten really popular and really big, they haven't gone through and rescanned Summit Point, even though it's had 2 new entire racetracks added to the complex. The Shenandoah Circuit and the Jefferson course has been expanded. They don't have the new Ozarks International Raceway in Missouri. They don't have Motorsports Ranch Houston. They don't have Black Hawk Farms in Illinois. They don't have Brainerd International Raceway, which reopened in the 2010s to host pro racing as Minnesota's only track, right? They don't have La Junta Raceway, which is an old airfield track in Colorado. It's one of Colorado's 3 club racing tracks.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like, and those are just a couple of examples. I don't want people watching the podcast to misconstrue. I don't mean that they have to go and grab those specific tracks. I just mean that flavor of a DLC. People would gobble it up like hotcakes if iRacing released an SCCA Spec Miata and a pack of like 10 different amateur club level racing tracks. One from each state, like 10 states on the East Coast or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, almost like a North American or even European equivalent to what we see in Automobilista 2 with what Reza done. Reza literally went out and built basically every Brazilian racing circuit, even like the really small stuff that, is admittedly not popular, maybe just has track days or a couple touring car series.
Exactly.
That
And that's why people love
Yep.
AMS2, by the way, is because they can go out and go, like AMS2 has a huge following from the Brazilian and South American audience, because they can go out and say, hey, look, they've got all of my tracks that I actually have driven on in real life. Look at Whippa, you know what I mean?
Yeah, whereas iRacing kind of started like that, and so did a lot of other racing sims. R-Factor's one of them. There's a couple now. Raceroom probably not, because Raceroom was more designed as kind of a mass market sim, but there have been, companies and devs to come out and say, like, hey, like, we want our game, not just to be this hobbyist thing, but like a legitimate training tool, so you can use our game to practice for upcoming race weekends or upcoming track days. And they've started out with their track or car library having track day stuff, having kind of these regional circuits that not a lot of people know, and then suddenly there's a little bit of money that gets thrown into it, and you're buying the same tracks across 5 or 6 different games. So I'm not saying, we should not have spawn a game, but be really tactful about what you put in your DLC stuff to make it worthwhile for everybody, instead of just functional equivalency.
Right, I just get bored. It just depresses me. If you're a developer out there and you want to make a small racing game or a new racing simulator, go to tracks that have no reputation. I guarantee you can get the license to make them in a racing game for so stupid cheap you wouldn't believe.
100%.
Go to places like Black Hawk Farm. Go to club tracks that are membership tracks like Autobahn Country Club, MSR Houston, stuff like that. Because I guarantee you, even if it doesn't have mass appeal, with that smaller level amateur cult appeal, you'll get more people anyway by doing something that nobody else does. You have a choice. You can either try to compete in the realm where everybody is making the same stuff, or you can do something that stands out. It's up to you. I know which one I think is easier.
Yeah, and especially because auto racing tends to have a lot of like really smart, nerdy guys in it. You might think, oh, like the millennial kids, playing our game every day on Twitch won't buy it, but that's really only part of your audience. There's a lot of guys in like the Spec Miata scenes or just like regional racing scenes who have like sim racing, centric PCs, who play this stuff pretty regularly. They just aren't on the forums. They just aren't posting on YouTube. They don't have Twitter accounts.
They don't talk a lot online, because most people who are real life racers are kind of like paranoid boomers. I'm not gonna lie.
And I mean,
right? So they're like,
there's some merit to that, right?
I don't use social media, and I don't talk to anybody, and I don't use my real name, and blah, 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 right? So like,
Well, and there's data to back that up too. Back in the day when ValueSoft, and I don't think it was Lucky Chicken Games, but I know it was ValueSoft was the publisher, made a string of like really basic budget NHRA drag racing games, late 90s, early 2000s, and like obviously the games went over quite poorly with the sim racing community, but they were still hugely popular online because every amateur drag racer with a somewhat capable PC bought that game. So that's kind of what we're pointing at might happen in this situation. There's not a whole lot of people clamoring for Raceway of the Ozarks or Area 27 out in BC online, but you have to realize that like everyone who pretty much owns like a McLaren probably has a Assetto Corsa at home and probably has a racing wheel. Or someone who runs like a Spec Miata probably has an iRacing account or knows what sim racing is.
Every shop that I go into have in the shop on the sales floor a simulator for people to use. It normally has a Fanatec DD on it, an old used out-of-spec real-life racing seat that isn't legal anymore on a custom mount, and then a giant single ultra-wide screen.
100%. And again, you can see pockets of that sentiment kind of pop up, especially with iRacing's dirt content. Because iRacing has went out and scanned a lot of like weird, dirt tracks that you probably never heard of. Because aside from like Knoxville and Eldora, the average auto racing fan doesn't really know about like Kokomo Speedway, right? Or like some of the really small stuff that has been demolished, like USA Speedway on iRacing, because I think that's like a legacy track now.
Right, but their immortalizations of amateur short tracks have genuinely. I mean, people don't realize this, but iRacing is big because of the oval racing part of their service, not the road racing.
And everyone who's ran like an amateur mini stock or like a street stock or a late model is like, oh my god, they have USA Speedway. My uncle raced there 10 years ago. I got to buy it. That's what we think is going to fuel, the kind of the purchasing power behind, getting more off-brand tracks. As opposed to this, well, this game has Spa, so we better have Spa on it too. And we're going to sell it as DLC. Now, when it comes to actually selling the DLC, we got to figure out a fair price point. And this is where things get really tricky, because every game and every developer out there has their own pricing structure, and you can end up paying wildly different prices for the exact same piece of content. Because that's the other flip side of this coin. Not only can you buy like Spa or the Nürburgring 6 or 7 different times, it'll all cost completely different amounts based on the sim you buy it for, even though at the end of the day, the sim might even be running on the same physics engine as the first sim you bought the track for, or the first car you bought, or the first sim you bought the car for, or like crazy shit happens like that. I mean, functionally, most of these games, when you get away from the nitpicking about tire models and stuff that me and Ted like to do, they all kind of drive the same to someone who's just getting into the hobby or has been around for a few years and isn't really pushing 110% every lap. And it's very weird how like you can buy Spa for like Racer, and it's $5 and it's pretty reasonable, and then you go to iRacing and the same track with the same level of detail is like $10 or $15. So what do you think could help determine or even just consider a fair price for just sim racing DLC?
That's dependent on a number of factors. It's dependent on how expensive it is for the company to produce them, how expensive it is for the company to then market them and sell them, how many people they think are going to buy them to get a return on investment, and then if you're the end user, for you there's factors such as how much am I going to use this DLC, how many pieces of content are in it, how many hours do I think I'm going to use them, right? Like, for example, I mentioned the RSS Lotus 79, which I used for like 5 to 10,000 kilometers. Looking back on it, I would have paid like $10 or $20 for that single car, right?
Yep.
But the thing that turns me off from using iRacing is that every single track and every single car is $11.95 or $14.95, $12 or $15, right? Those are their only two prices. They have been that way since the early 2000s. They never sell anything for anything other than $12 or $15, right?
Well,
and for me, if it's a small amateur, unless it's a tech track that isn't complete, I apologize. Unless it's a track that I know I'm only going to drive for 10 laps, right? How am I supposed to determine that putting the same value on each purchase is appropriate, especially if it's only a single piece of content, correct?
Yeah, that's the biggest flaw with iRacing right now in terms of their pricing structure.
Why don't they do discounted season packs or something like that? Hey, drive this whole NASCAR season. It's one car and the 10 weeks of tracks, and it's like $50 or $60 instead of $15 for each. I would be much more willing to do something like that.
Yeah, and we brought this up before we clicked record. The reason a lot of people have qualms with iRacing's pricing structure is not the monetary value itself, because a lot of people can afford $10 or $15 every week to drive a new track. It really is the cost of a meal at Subway, and I mean the answer to affording it is just don't be a fat ass and eat fast food every week. But I think what a lot of people are actually upset at is that sometimes they end up buying content that they don't use a lot, and those $12 or $14 purchases really start adding up. Like, I mean, if you're an American, there's not a lot of time slots to race the V8 supercar. You can spend like $15 on the V8 supercar, which is, a pretty decent chunk of money, only to discover that like there's no time slot for you to race it in, unless you do like the obligatory like top split, or strength of field race for the American crowd. And this goes on, throughout iRacing's car roster as well. Like, there's not a lot of people racing the Lotus 49 because it's hard. There's not a lot of people racing the Lotus 79 because that's hard too. There's not a lot of people racing or will be racing, here in due time, the front-wheel drive touring cars, just because it's not something iRacing does very well. The cars are better objectively in race room. iRacing, I think, has its own third-party site run by just some guy who takes an aggregate of like all the different participation levels across all the different series in iRacing. So he actually basically has a chart of like that basically says do not buy this car. But some people who don't know any better will go out and buy that car and have to pay, $50-$60 in content they don't use, only to discover, hey, that was kind of a ripoff. So in a perfect world, when not factoring in licenses and all the other fun stuff, because you're right, that does determine a lot. Like, I've heard the licenses for Le Mans and in particular Suzuka is apparently just insane to get. Like, just an unreasonable amount of money. That does factor in what these companies sell their DLC for. But of course, every company does have a different deal with each brand, which is why you'll see fluctuating prices for the same piece of content across multiple sims. But in a perfect world, it really should be priced based on what the company anticipates will get used a whole lot. And I think that wouldn't be the worst way for iRacing and other devs to go about it. You know, like, if let's say AC puts out a not a payware car, but like a piece of DLC of like some experimental, like, kind of like the Nike 2022 car in Gran Turismo. If AC put out a car like that for 99 cents, the average person would probably buy it. They'd be like, fuck, it's 99 cents. I don't give a shit. When you charge $15 for it, and again, this is just like a worst case scenario. If you were to charge 15 or 20 bucks for it, people would be like, what the fuck are you doing? And I think that's in general what the pricing structure in a perfect world probably should adhere to, especially when it comes to tracks too. Like,
I kind of think that $3 to $5 range is the sweet spot, where the company can make money off of the licensing and production charge, but they aren't overcharging the average end user. I would say $3 to $5 for a single piece of content maximum, and maybe $10 or $15 to like a 10 car and track pack is perfectly acceptable.
Yeah, packs should be $10 to $15, so you're basically paying a dollar per content. And then like individual pieces of content, especially for more hardcore sims like R Factor, like a race room type deal, like an iRacing type deal, you really shouldn't be going beyond $5. And then again, if you as a dev are making a piece of content that you know is going to be a fad, the Dallara IR01, the fake car they released a few months back, or the Formula V, that, like, you know, it was something everyone bought for a period of time, but like realistically, they're probably not going to have much staying power.
The Formula V is the new rookie car.
Okay.
It was free.
Okay, that's good then. But like the Dallara IR01, well, they went and built a fake car for like a Grand Prix championship, but suddenly they got the Mercedes car. So now,
by the way, I'm still fucking angry that iRacing said they refused to do vintage content or content for things that didn't exist anymore or that wasn't real or was fantasy, and then over COVID they started doing it. But I still don't have vintage versions of tracks to drive the Lotus 49 on.
Yeah, like, I mean, they went out and built the Chicago Street Circuit. That was $15 or something. They went out and built Coca-Cola Super Speedway. That was $15. They went out and built a fake F1 car. That was $15. So $45 in content that they said they would never make.
Yeah, in my opinion, that's a huge betrayal. Then why don't I have my Charade Circuit or my vintage Nürburgring or my vintage Longford Speedway for my Lotus 49 to race at?
Yeah, and they can't answer that.
Because the people who made iRacing made Grand Prix Legends and said, no, we're never going to release non-licensed vintage content for tracks that don't exist anymore to fit the Lotus 49 now. We're a serious sim company. And then COVID happened, and they're like, hey, here's a 1987 NASCAR and a recreation in North Wilkesboro and a fake Speedway we made and a fake F1 car. Here you go.
Well, that goes back to what I said in regards to point 1 and 2 with developers respecting their fans. Like, if you're going to put out a piece of DLC, make sure it's kind of something, you know, the fans actually want. Make sure it respects, like, what you're trying to do with your game. Make sure it respects, you know, the amount of money your fans are going to have to spend on it. And they kind of dropped the ball there on several fronts. Now, in terms of the forbidden topic that is going to get us into a lot of trouble here, payware mods, because not only do developers release, you know, DLC packs for their game, some are pretty good, some are not so great. Sim racing, you know, over the last, I would say 10 to 15 years, has kind of aligned itself with the flight sim scene, which is huge into payware content. Usually, when you buy like Microsoft Flight Sim X back in the day, your purchase doesn't end at just the game. Usually it's expected.
No, you have to buy.
It's expected you go and get terrains and you go and get add-on planes, and it's expected that, you know, you're gonna rack up a couple $100 and just like crap for flight sim, and
it is perfectly reasonable and a standard practice and accepted to consider, hey, the Russian Sukhoi development firm is giving away military secrets to put the Su-27 or the MiG-21 in my DCS combat simulator, so I'm gonna pay $60 or $100 for just that one aircraft, right?
And that mentality, because racing sims as an industry has kind of said, hey, we kind of want to be considered on par with the level of seriousness as flight simulators are. They've adopted kind of the payware mod model, whether it be payware cars or payware tracks, definitely more payware cars because I think they're easier to make, and usually devs do a pretty okay job at filling out the track roster. But it's resulted in a really weird market to navigate because not all payware content is all that great, and it's always priced way all over the map. Some payware content is literally pennies on the dollar. I think I bought like a VRC car for Project Cars 2 that was $2. It was like the Trans Am Camaro, but it can quickly get like pretty outlandish and start rivaling, the actual DLC prices for like official pieces of content. So it's probably worth talking about, like, are payware mods worth it at the end of the day?
I think so. So if I'm paying like $3 to $5 for a single circuit that I put 1,000 kilometers on, I personally find that acceptable. I know some people won't, but I do. I think when it comes to cars, you can put even more time on cars than you can on tracks, because you could drive a car on any track, but you can't drive any track with any car, right? I think when it comes to payware and DLC, again, it just comes down to a simple formula. Do I have a league or racing series I'm going to use this in? If yes, buy it. If I'm worried about the price, is the price reasonable for the amount of hours that I'm going to put into it, okay? Now, for example, let me lay out some costs for other hobbies. Like if you do local oval racing, normally they'll charge you like $50 to $100 for a Friday practice before the Saturday race. Is that about right, Austin?
That sounds about.
Yeah, so something like that.
35, but yeah.
It's like $35 to $100 depending on how big the track is, if it's asphalt oval or dirt oval, right? About $100 to practice, and then you're probably going to use like $200 to $400 of tires and like $100 of fuel, and then like $50 of towing gas, right? So an extra practice night for an amateur oval racing series is probably going to be like $500 for your, how much, an hour of track time maybe, right?
Yeah, that's about right.
If you're on a road course, a track day is going to be $100 to $150 if you do it with a really cheap program to get your hour to 2 hours of track time. Maybe $300 to $400. An amateur car race is going to be a $500 to $1,000 entry fee, depending on the track. You're starting to see where I'm going with this, right?
Yep.
If I'm spending $5 on, like, for example, F3 Classic tracks, I really love his tracks. He made a shit ton of mods for Grand Prix Legends. If I go and buy his vintage Hockenheim or Zandvoort, and I spend 10 hours driving it for $5, if I get 10 hours out of $5, my profit margin is ridiculous. You know what I mean?
Yep, absolutely agree. I do have a bit of an alternate take on it, though, in that I think payware mods are worth it on paper because, again, most, especially in the realm of Assetto Corsa, most have been worth it. I would say 80% of them have been worth it because the mod is high enough quality, usually doesn't have any weird quirks that, I could feel confident buying it and be like, yeah, that was a good, worthwhile addition to my collection. However, on the flip side, I will say if you are, in this hobby and you don't want to be liberally throwing around cash because it does add up, I'm actually going to say to hold off for now because at the end of the day, very few leagues I've raced in, whether it be on sim racing system or through private stuff, have actually made use of payware content. I mean, that was a pretty serious problem, especially on sim racing system, which is supposed to be an app that only makes use of non-ripped or converted models. So basically, only default AC stuff, only AC DLC, and only payware. And it took, I would say, 6 years until there was finally a league with payware content in it. I mean, I had purchased like the RSS GT1 cars like the moment they came out, and they're really good. And it took until 2018 or 2019 for them to show up in any league anywhere. One thing that has prevented payware mods from getting completely out of control in sim racing is that the pricing has always been pretty reasonable. Like, regardless of who's selling it, whether it be, I think the three big ones are URD, RSS, and VRC. Like, I never have an issue with the pricing of their stuff. It's always very good. The only thing I really have an issue of is realizing that I've bought it and it's sat in AC, basically not driven because it turned out I was one of the few people who bought it and was compelled to host a series with it. And that's the problem you do run into with this stuff, is that even if you sign up for something like SRS or like one of the bigger sim organizing applications, whatever you want to call them, there's like 4 or 5 of them out now. I found that like very rarely did they actually make use of payware content. So like if I was in a different financial situation, I would feel pretty choked because it doesn't seem like a lot of people have adopted it. I do know that like there's a lot of people that are buying the RSS stuff. Like I've just heard through the grapevine that like the profit margins are pretty huge and like it's been good for those guys, but you just don't see it a whole lot online. And even when it comes to like running in public servers on AC, like the most popular public servers after all this time are still just like Nürburgring track days with Dream Pack 1, right? So like again, I would say 80% to 85% of payware stuff I've bought, and even though it's really good and it was, you know, a worthwhile addition in quotations, I hardly ever drove it because no one else was. So it's kind of made this weird contradiction of like, yeah, it kind of was worth it because I love AC, but it's not worth it because for whatever reason it's just not carrying over to the online side of things. The other thing that I've liked some content creators are doing is just adding a donate button. I think that was really intelligent. Like the guy who runs Content Manager, you can get Content Manager basically for free. I think it's Content Manager anyway, or it could be the custom shaders patch. It's one of the two. I think it's Content Manager. And you don't have to pay a dime for Content Manager if you don't want to, but there is a donate button. There is, I think, like a Patreon for the guy. And that kind of satisfies both parties. Because, like, even if you don't pay for it, there are enough people who are like, yeah, I'll buy him a beer. And that's profitable. And you also run into situations where freeware content can accidentally devalue payware content. Because there's really nothing stopping with especially with AC being such a modular game. You know, sometimes like 3 or 4 different mod groups will make the same car, and most drive pretty close to each other. You'd see this a lot back in the days of like R Factor 1 or like Race 07 or GTR Evo mods, where it's like stuff that was sold as payware was typically as good or on par with freeware stuff. So now the existence of those freeware mods kind of devalues the payware stuff a little bit and makes you question, like, okay, what should you actually charge for this? A good example of this being the CTDP 2005 and 2006 F1 mods for the original R Factor. That was an entire season of high-quality F1 cars that drove really well for absolutely free, versus VRC, which sells one car or 1 or 2 cars from that season as standalone piecemeal content in a payware format. And you can pretty much sit there and argue, well, like, the CTDP is good enough, you know, in R Factor, the 05 or 06 F1 mod is good enough in R Factor that, like, I really don't want to pay for that same car in AC when both drive really good. So it raises all kinds of weird questions about, like, hey, should people even be doing this at all?
Yeah, I think it's a way more complicated equation than people give it credit for. Because when you take somebody for whom that is a job, let's say it's another professional coach, like the guy who runs the VRC, the guy who runs like the what's that racing school for iRacing? VRS, example. Let's say it's the guy from VRS. Let's say he's a professional coach. He has to write the coaching, and imagine this example is for a track or a car. He has to write the coaching, he has to script the coaching, he has to buy the equipment to record it, he has to record it, he has to put it on the internet and edit it. If not himself, he has to pay somebody, and then he has to pay however many thousands of dollars for a marketing campaign so it reaches enough people to buy it to make it profitable, right?
Yep.
Why does that person...
Yep.
I don't want to say why does that person not deserve money, because I know that sounds entitled, but imagine this was a business. If somebody was doing that with like couches, if somebody ran like a local, like there's a Happy Harry's furniture store down the street from me, they make handmade furniture, right?
Yep.
The freeware content is their Amazon $100 couch versus their $500 handmade wood couch.
Yep.
You know what I'm saying here, right?
Yep.
So why does that person who puts in all that extra effort, who does everything for a massive loss, who puts their heart and soul into learning this trade, not deserve people's money? That's a very difficult question. Question. Because like we had a couple of good comments. Our last episode where we complained about people making the same mods over and over again, he made the point it's all about money. If people buy it, people are going to make it, right?
Yep.
So if you take these people who put all this amazing quality and effort into their work, I personally think that they deserve my money, because my money is an expression of the value of my time, right? I am literally getting paid A, B, C, D, E, F, G rate for XYZ amount of my life spent on doing a task. Correct?
Yep.
So if this person is spending, and people don't understand this, thousands of hours per mod to make a mod, yes, they deserve my money, right? Because a 10-minute, I know that a 10-minute YouTube video, if I want to edit it to a high enough quality, actually takes 5 to 10 hours to make a whole workday, correct?
Yep, that sounds about right.
So imagine how difficult it is to make a high-quality mod if you don't have a team and you're just a contracting individual, right?
It's almost like the payware mod scene kind of arose from these games getting more and more complex and detailed. And the reason you saw so many crazy mods back in the day for stuff like R Factor or Sports Car GT is because like track models and car models are still pretty primitive. Same with physics, you know?
Yeah, so it was so easy to do. People could just poop out free shit, basically, right?
Yeah,
but the result is that it wasn't that vetted and the quality wasn't that good. So now that AC and iRacing and AMS2 and R Factor 2 are professional grade simulation softwares that are available to amateurs, right? People almost have to charge money for how much time they're putting into something in order to then be able to put out that product and not ruin their own personal life. How much time does it take them to make that thing, right?
Yeah, because it's not like the days of Monster Truck Madness or again, Sports Car GT, where it was basically kids and just guys in their 20s and 30s being like, well, I'm going to fuck around and make some mods after work. And it takes them a couple days, maybe a couple weeks. But like they get something out and it's fine, it's acceptable, and people have fun with it. But now it's like, you know, for an AC track to be worth your time, like the road mesh has to be like ridiculously high quality. You know, the surrounding environment, you know, you can't cut corners on, or you result in stuff like Sebring that we had to race on for years in SRS, where it was just like, why are we racing here? This is terrible. So there's a minimum threshold of quality that's just much higher than where it ever used to be before. So now people are being like, hey, like you kind of need to you kind of need to pay for this. But again, because we're still in a transitionary phase, some guys are just talented enough to put all this shit out basically for free still, and it's devaluing what the payware guys are doing and leading to weird arguments where both sides are correct.
It starts to get ridiculously complicated super fast, and a whole bunch of people's different opinions are correct from a certain point of view. And it's very, very difficult to determine who deserves to be right and who deserves to be wrong and who deserves money for their work and who should have been doing free work instead.
And it's resulted in this kind of a stalemate as opposed to one opinion prevailing and the community continues on from there. It's just this weird stalemate. And no one really knows where to go from there, so you have essentially two existing ideologies competing for a share in the market. And sometimes they win and sometimes they lose, and it's just a really awkward situation. Because as you introduce more and more, you know, additional content into a sim racing ecosystem, you start fracturing the user base, and that's not something we need.
Exactly, and that's exactly what happens. There's people who decide, oh, these people who rip mods aren't worth ever talking to for me. Blah 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 blah. And there's people who decide anybody who charges money for a mod is a piece of shit who's just after money and a two-faced liar. Blah 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 blah. And then they don't talk to each other. Or they talk shit about each other behind one another's back, even though they're basically working on the same thing at a different quality level, and one's deciding to charge and one isn't, right?
And if they have any pull in like sim racing organizations or leagues or stuff like that, it results in certain pieces of content getting ignored.
Right.
And then you start fractioning an already small user base, especially in some of the smaller games like AC or even like stuff like P-Cars or R Factor, Race Room. You just like fraction all of it, and the user base, you know, is left with like, well, who can I race with?
Yeah, because everybody's got a problem with somebody, and there's nowhere safe for me to go to get away from the drama. It sucks, guys. It really, really sucks. It's really hard. I don't know what the answer is.
It could be something as simple as what Ilya has done with Content Manager, and just have a donate button, and just start from there, because you could technically get around some of the issues with, for example, not having the license to make a Ferrari mod, because you don't have a merchant license or a sales license, by just saying, well, you're not really paying for that product for the Ferrari brand, you're just donating to me personally because you like my work, and if I make a Ferrari, that's all well and cool.
But then again, there's that problem of somebody has that sunk cost into creating it already. if people can access the content for free, because let's be honest, if somebody puts a donate button up, nobody, like maybe 10% of people are going to donate that use it. So they're rather than, hey, I charge $3 for this and I make 50% less sales, they then still get that money. They're still at a 40% loss for that versus donating instead, right?
You know what will probably fix this is following the flight sim model even more as we go into the future of sim racing. So the next generation of sims, like AC2, let's say Project Cars 4, R Factor 3, just whatever comes out in the next generation, the way this would be fixed is there's such a massive leap in quality in the next generation of racing sims that the community just can't make something, on their own. It has to be either a proper payware mod team.
Modding is almost going to be done away with because the barrier to entry is going to be so high. And this is actually really interesting. I think that the next installment of AC is going to do away with modding because of all the weird legality issues with modding for the first Assetto Corsa.
And what'll happen is it'll do something like Flight Sim X, where there's like an in-game storefront and just approved sellers.
I genuinely think sim racing is going to lead that way for 3 reasons, okay? 1, the company originally making the software is not going to be culpable for any stolen mods if they do that. 2, they're going to be able to have people contribute to the game and release DLCs for cheap or for free based on the work of the community and be able to basically profit off of other people's labor, and what company doesn't want to do that, right? And then 3, like we're talking about, they'll be able to vet that process and make it as high quality as possible. You won't have all these arguments over what's the difference between a rip versus a fully original mod that happens in Assetto Corsa all the time. Because in AC2, I'm guessing they're just not going to let you mod unless you can prove that you're a reputable individual with a business that can find the data and make it 100% accurate.
Well, and what's crazy is this is already happening in a couple of different places. I believe it happens in the train simulator community. A lot of the payware is released on like the actual Steam page, just again through vetted vendors. It's happening in Microsoft Flight Sim. So when you boot up Microsoft Flight Sim itself, like the new 2020 version, there's a storefront and you can sort by, again, these officially licensed vendors. So the equivalent for us would be booting up AC2, and you go to the in-game AC DLC page, and you can click a tab that says what's new from Kunos, what's new from RSS, what's new from URD, and there's really just like 5 approved vendors. And lastly, and most importantly, this, as Ted has exactly described, has already appeared in Live for Speed. They recently introduced mods to their game, but not just anyone can upload a mod. When you send a mod to be verified, it goes through the dev team, and they can give the final thumbs up or thumbs down, and that determines whether it actually appears on the in-game mod browser. So you can go in if you have an LFS S3 license and go through the mod selection page inside the car select screen, and you'll notice that there's no Ferrari 458. You'll notice that all the cars generally have the same art style as the cars in the vanilla game, even down to the ambiguous names. Like, I drove the kart car the other night. It was called Formula Downforce 93. That's because the actual devs, or it was like Formula US 93. So that's because the actual devs implemented a vetting system like Ted and I have been talking about in terms of like payware mods, that no, the developers actually have the final say in what gets put into their game or not. And they can hand curate and even say things like, no, you have to change the name of your car because it's too close to a licensed product. That, as sim racing grows as an industry and these games get more and more complex, that's where this is going to go. AC might be the last of its kind in terms of a modding paradise, because it'll just be so much effort for the average person to make a high quality car, they just won't even bother anymore. And B, like you mentioned in regards to the legality of this stuff, I don't think Kunos will want to deal with the headache of having flying penis vagina cars, for lack of a better word, or tracks or cars that they don't really have the rights to, or like really weird shit, like how notoriously protective Ferrari is of their brand. I don't think Ferrari is very happy because I don't know if a lot of people remember this, but the OG Ferrari DLC for AC, it doesn't let you race Ferrari F1 cars against any other car in the game. Well, people obviously found a way to mod their way around that. I wouldn't doubt that Kunos got in a little bit of trouble for that and for whatever their next release is going to be, they're going to have to find a way to just completely disable that, or all the little other intricate licensing issues. Like, I heard, one of the wild things I heard from one of our old buddies who was on, like, the internal test team, was that, like, the LaFerrari had to be quicker than the McLaren P1 at certain tracks, in certain conditions. Like, some licenses get really crazy, and it's not the first time I've heard something like that across multiple games. So, because of that stuff, and because of the aforementioned flying penis vagina cars that everyone paints, they might slowly pull back the reins on what we're allowed to do when it comes to modding, and really have it turn into, just a proper flight sim storefront, which is not necessarily good for the future of the sim racing community. But at the end of the day, we have had 20 years of growth already. The people who wanted to get into 3D modeling and make cool shit for these games have had more than enough time to get their shit together, become noticed, build a business, and start an outlet like RaceSim Studio to prepare for this situation. And unfortunately, if you missed out, that's it. I think we've got ourselves a podcast too.
Thank you for listening to episode 5 of the Sim Racing Rejects podcast. If you want to support us, don't forget that the best way to do so is to share the video around with anybody who you think might be interested in listening to our horrible trash tier opinions. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and remember that we'll read Bible verses at you like Jason Jacoby if you do anything that we ever possibly even mildly disagree with. I'll catch you later now. Bye-bye.